Among his most senior international positions, Edwards served as the U.S.-nominated Deputy Ambassador of one of the largest democracy and human rights missions in the world, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, their mission in Kosovo. He personally negotiated an 11th-hour agreement between Serbia and Kosovo that averted a crisis and another confrontation between two neighbors. The breakthrough earned the praise of leaders on both sides, along with the praise of Secretary Hillary Clinton and the Secretary General of the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. Mr. Joseph served in every theater and every conflict-affected country in the Balkans. He served with the United Nations, the United States Army, he is a veteran, NATO, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, and NGOs such as Catholic Relief Services, who I came to respect during my time in Afghanistan, and the International Crisis Group. He served on missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Haiti. One of these missions, I believe he was the last to meet with Pakistan's Benazir Bhutto shortly before she was assassinated. So one could say he's been there and done that. So in addition to his work as a scholar and a lecturer and a publisher of articles in Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, and just about all the other venues, he's speaking not just as a scholar who studies it, but as someone with extensive on-the-ground experience. So if you could please check again to be sure your phones are off, and join me in welcoming Mr. Edwards for his talk on what we can learn from Mr. Trump's foreign policy.
Dr. Smallwood, thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate that, and I would just take this opportunity to point out your own extensive experience in many of these same theaters. So looking forward to hearing your own questions and comments as we move on. And I mentioned to Peter at the outset that I do want this to be a conversation. And so when it comes time for questions, I hope that you disregard that standard comment that you hear often, which ask a question, don't make a comment. I invite you to make a comment and ask a question. Either way, it should be a conversation. That's how it should be. I look forward to a dialogue. And really, it's kind of an experiment that I'm going to try tonight. You know, there's a tactic, device that people often recommend to open up a presentation, which is you should have humor. You should have a joke, a humorous story at the beginning. So here's my attempt at humor. What if we could have a completely objective conversation about Donald Trump? Okay? Good one? All right? Good one. And if you think about it, what makes it so difficult is it's not just, it's polarizing. It's that there's polarization about the polarization. So the defensive,ness and the Trump derangement syndrome, and you don't get it, and look at these outrages, how can you ignore that? So it is such an interference to having an objective discussion, and yet we need to do that. We need to, for example, in the realm of foreign policy, we have to be able to understand the world. We have to understand how the dynamics of this White House are acting and affecting the rest of the world and our interests in that world. So we have to find a way to be able to think about that, even though it's not very easy. And it's, when you think about it, there's really basically two ways you can judge any president, foreign policy. You can judge them by their own objectives and say, look, this is what they said they were going to do, America first, and so forth. And did they achieve that or not? So that would be one way. And another way to do it is to say, these are important national security goals. This is what America should stand for. This is what we should expect. And you would try to posit an objective. So you could have a subjective view or an objective view, and then rate the president accordingly. And even if you tried one of these, even if the former, even if you just tried to say, well, look, I'm just going to look at President Trump and examine it by his own objectives. And some people have tried to do that. But even that is very difficult to do because the issues themselves, his positions on the issues themselves are polarized. For example, climate change, or migration. So you would have to remove yourself from any position on the issue before you even delved into it. You'd have to say, well, I don't really have a position on climate change, but he said he would do this, and well, he provided Paris. So you could do that, but I don't even know how useful that would be. And there's other issues like that. The liberal order. This is one of the biggest ones. The rules-based liberal order that the U.S. Really did set up at the end of World War II, which many people think has served us very well, and of course is in a state of disarray right now. And there's a big debate, I can tell you, a big debate on whether Donald Trump is a symptom of that breakdown caused by a number of factors, or whether he is an agent actively promoting that. So there's a big debate about that. But again, very difficult to have an objective conversation about that. And the other element here, if you take a step back and look at, well, what are the basic views of Donald Trump's foreign policy? What is out there already? So we want to have our own conversation tonight. Let's take a second and think about what's out there already. The way I see this is it's a continuum that goes from high praise on one end to sharp, very sharp criticism on the other. And it moves right through. So let's think about that. I think that's a good way, if we kind of think about what others have said, it maybe prompt us to think about our own way that we would approach this. So let's take praise. Very proud. Ryan Zimmerman is a graduate of UVA, as many of you know. And, so, you know, after winning the World Series, they went to the White House, and Ryan Zimmerman presented President Trump with a Nationals jersey with Trump's name on it, and he said this to Donald Trump publicly. He said, "Thank you, Mr. President, for keeping us safe." Okay? That sums up in a very vivid way the Trump supporter view of foreign policy. He has kept us safe. He got out Baghdad. He got out Baghdad. You remember President Obama, very proudly, he and Vice President Biden decided that they got Osama bin Laden. So he's very proud he got out Baghdad. He kept us safe. America first. He's looking out for us. This is the line, this is the approach of the Trump supporter. He's standing up to China. He's standing up for us. We're not going to get taken by others. We're not going to get taken by these freeloaders in NATO and in other organizations. So that is the viewpoint of the Trump supporter. Now, we move down that continuum. Move down to we start to get some criticism. We start to get criticism even in Congress. Even among Republicans in Congress, we start to get criticism. There was quite sharp Republican criticism of President Trump on the abrupt recent pullout from Syria. And even Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, who's very close and helpful to President Trump, used these words, which I was at an event, they were cited by General Petraeus. They were cited by David Petraeus, and he said, I fully agree with what the Senate Majority Leader said, talking about the pullout, the abrupt pullout from Syria, leaving the Kurds exposed, our close, very close, important ally in the fight against ISIS, the ones who did the critical house-to-house fighting on the ground against ISIS. And McConnell called that a grave strategic error. And that's what General Petraeus speaks of. And I will agree with the words of the Senate Majority. So you begin in the Senate itself to get criticism of Trump. You also got criticism of Trump from Republicans and Democrats, both, on the relationship with Saudi Arabia. So the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, those of you who know about the brutal killing the Saudis did at the consulate in Turkey of this activist, writer, that drew sharp criticism in Congress, including resolutions citing the Saudis as culpable when the White House was walking away and essentially whitewashing them. Also, sharp bipartisan criticism of Trump over the war in Yemen, supporting the Saudi effort of the war in Yemen, which has brought that country to not the brink of a humanitarian disaster, but an actual terrible humanitarian disaster. So that's the next area. Then you come into another area, which is just sort of a general critique in the middle, that says, well, if you look at Donald Trump, there's some academics that have this approach, well, if you judge him by his goals, actually he's not as radical as he sounds, and he hasn't been terribly effective in what he's tried to achieve, and so there's sort of right in the middle of the continuum, there's that. And then we start to get into the more serious criticism. And I put this into two baskets, the serious criticism. The first basket is from advisors to the president, and now I should use the word former advisors to the president. So you know what I'm talking about. James Mattis is one, for example, who resigned and made it very clear that his resignation was in sharp disagreement with the president, particularly on this question of the approach to Syria. And then there was the famous case in the realm of trade that involved the economic advisor, Gary Cohn, who reportedly, this has been reported several times in several places, reportedly took a document off the desk, the president's desk in the Oval Office, that would have reversed the trade agreement with South Korea. This is apparently, again, widely reported. So advisors like this themselves felt that the president's approach was so impulsive and counter to U.S. interests that they took action and ultimately resigned. And then finally we move to, of course, the bastion of criticism, which again is in two parts. You have in the Republican Party the never-Trumpers, and you have then Democrats. Both at times for different reasons, but mainly in a shared concern about what I mentioned, the assault, as they see it, on the liberal international order, and in particular, a concern about praise of dictators and above all, of course, Vladimir Putin. And this criticism has really been sort of the focal point, both of elements of the Republican Party, that wing called the National Security Wing, and of course the width and breadth of the Democratic Party. And by no means is it just limited to those two issues. But that's the continuum, just to sort of give us a rough idea of, gee, how do people look at the Donald Trump foreign policy? That's the length of it. I will add this, let me add one other point, that even serious critics of the president. I mean, real dyed-in-the-wool, never-Trumpers all the way. Concede, and one important point, and that is that we haven't suffered the calamity that we had anticipated, or calamities that we had anticipated with this. And then if you can imagine here where some advisors feel compelled to resign, to take other steps, which you could easily imagine. Now let's remember, there's still time. There's still time. So, and in fact, one of them wrote an article. He's actually the dean of my school, Elliot Cohen, and he wrote an article called Trump's Lucky Year, so he attributes a lot of it to luck. But whatever. That really is the purpose of my presentation and our conversation this evening, is to look at this in as objective a fashion as we can. It's not that we've staked out a position here and therefore we're only looking for the bad stuff, or we're Trump defenders and we're only looking for the good stuff, and we don't believe the critics who never gave him a fair chance. No. What is it that we can learn from this tremendously unorthodox approach to foreign policy? So, how are we going to do that? How are we going to do that? My experiment has 3 elements. This is my experiment for us this evening. 3 elements. First is, we got to take some topics off the table. So we got to take climate change off the table. We got to take migration, some elements even of trade policy maybe we just can't. It's just infused. How you think about the issues is immediately how you're going to think about his workers. It's just not going to be a good use of time. So take a few of those off. And then the second one is this, is when thinking about the Trump approach, contrary to how we would look at most presidents, what I suggest is we have to look at style as much as substance. We have to kind of look and try to do our best to make sense of the style. And it's very contradictory. To try to make sense and then to apply that and to see what it actually meant and means in the world. And that's the third element here. I tried to come up and think of a way, how could you do this? How could you create, maybe think of like a thought experiment that really would lead people to approach this in kind of a dispassionate way, an analytical way. And here's what I came up with. I came up with this. That regardless of your views, that regardless of your political persuasion, your views, whatever, how you can really begin to approach this in a way that's collective and collaborative. And what I came up with is, it's not perfect, but this is the best I could do, is imagine that there's a new president, for whatever reason. For whatever reason. There's a new president 1 year, who's elected 1 year from now. Okay, it's November 2019, so imagine it's November 2020. He's just been, he or she has just been elected. And that president is now president-elect. And the president calls on you and says, I want you to chair a small bipartisan team to tell me what to do about foreign policy, based on the Trump record. Election's over. I don't need to criticize anybody. I don't need to make any points. I need you to lead this small bipartisan team and tell me what the heck Trump was up to and how that should inform how I see the world. And you've only got a couple of weeks to do this. So, those are my 3 points. So how would you go about doing it? Let me tell you. Largely, very likely because of the attention that it gives to Trump. So that's another key element. And yet, Trump can be opposite of personal. Reportedly, I think this is stunning, absolutely stunning. He reportedly, at a meeting, one of these multilateral confabs in Europe, he reportedly, and I've seen this in very reliable places, threw candy at German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Threw candy, sort of launched some candy and said, "There, I'm on. Don't say I never gave you any." So, and this is the guy, again, he shoved the Montenegrin prime minister out of the way. So, this is the guy, on the one hand, capable of all this fawning compliments and willingness to meet in personal and a belief in establishing personal rapport, and then the other hand, completely disregarding that and doing the opposite of that. Again, a strange and sharp contrast. Other elements, a lot of Donald Trump's rhetoric on foreign policy is pecuniary. A lot of it is about money. Because with the Saudis, he'll bring on a chart, and look how many weapons they're going to buy. Look how many planes. Look, they're going to spend $100 billion on our weapons. Trots out these numbers, pecuniary. And it also cites the cost. Cites the cost, for example, of munitions. He says, we don't want to drop those bombs. Each one of those costs, and he'll mention a figure, whether it's accurate or not is another story, but he will often cite the pecuniary. At the same time, where's the cost-benefit analysis in a lot of these key decisions? For example, the one that I mentioned, the pullout of this small, relatively small contingent of troops in Syria. Where's the cost-benefit analysis? There's so much emphasis on pecuniary, and yet very little of a cost-benefit analysis there. We see that he's obviously contemptuous of a lot of our allies, contemptuous of our alliances, says NATO is obsolete, makes these sharp criticisms, says the Germans are captive to Russia. Actually has elements of truth to it, but quite brazen, bold statement. And so, especially to an ally, very important ally, Germany, critical, really the linchpin in Europe. And at the same time, so he's this dismissive and critical to allies. And yet it's just simply a fact. He praises dictators. So this is a fact. It's really not a question of your support or viewpoint. And not just Putin. He praises Duterte in the Philippines. He praises Bolsonaro in Brazil. He is very thick with this Nigel Farage in the UK. So again, we see a contrast there. There's another curious contrast. Trump, it can be really largely quite amoral. You see that on the Khashoggi murder, completely covering and whitewashing that there. And again, and also not very effusive on human rights. And yet, he was moved by the chemical weapons strikes, in the use of chemical weapons by Bashar Assad in Syria to make 2 attacks. And twice, the U.S. in 2 separate occasions in successive years made strikes on Syria over the chemical weapons attacks. And reportedly, the second strike, he had a more extensive target list and then Mattis unilaterally drew it down. But these were significant strikes, and there was, if you remember. Also, another one that's curious, quite oddity, is the position on Venezuela. So Nicolas Maduro, dictator, but a dictator of the left. It's a bit surprising that President Trump would get engaged in a serious way to try to back a democratic guy of the people, non-corrupt, fighting corruption, standing up for human rights, the opposition leader, and try, working even in a multilateral fashion with the Organization of American States, getting their approval to try to put pressure and to get rid of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. So again, sort of a curious mix there. And then finally, of course, lots of unpredictability. Remember the idea to purchase Greenland? I'm going to buy Greenland. This is just came out of nowhere. Impulsive, the pullout of Syria, and then the immediate effort to try to, after the Turkey went in, to then say, oh well, try to cover it up with a letter to Erdogan at a meeting. So kind of an impulsive and almost amateurish attempt. And then, compared to Barack Obama, they shared a iconoclastic sort of contempt for what Obama called the Washington playbook. This was, Obama used that term, and some of his advisors had this very contemptuous attitude towards this sort of foreign policy establishment in Washington, which Trump shares. And yet, a lot of the motivation for Donald Trump's foreign policy is almost very likely vindictiveness towards Obama. So there's very likely that, for example, the signature foreign policy achievement of the Obama administration, the agreement with Iran, the Iran nuclear deal, clearly pulling out was connected with a vindictive satisfaction in taking away that signature achievement from Barack Obama. And finally, we see also in this want to be an iconoclast and do everything in a new way and break the mold, and at the same time, a lot of the approach of the Trump administration is conventional, peace through strength, build up of the military, a lot of praise of the military, and again, that's hardly conventional for a guy who's projecting himself as so unconventional and iconoclastic, and then a lot of it, the substance is rather conventional. So, wanting to preserve their time for conversation. So, drawing on all that, what would you say then to this president-elect? You go through all this, you have a review, you sit back, what did Trump do, what happened, what actually happened? What would you then say? This is what I would say, and I'll sum it up kind of quickly. I would say, Mr. or Madam President-elect, I would say, here's the bottom line. The Trump foreign policy has imposed a lot of short-term costs on the U.S. and long-term costs that we don't even know about. But even in the short term, the relationship with our allies has frayed, and that has made it harder for us to contain adversaries like China. We have, by the uncertainty that we projected about our position, we've undermined our attempt to contain China. Japan and China are closer together, and our allies, Japan and South Korea, are farther apart. And that's attributable, in large part, to an inconstancy, despite the fact that actually the Trump administration has not only moved on trade, but also in the military sphere with China. So we are undermining our effort, this new and quite significant attempt to restrain China with this gratuitous uncertainty that we inject. I said, there's a cost, Mr. and Madam President-elect, there's a cost to that. And our adversaries, Russia, it's clear, is emboldened by this. We see, not only in the Middle East, but in Western Europe. And even here, we know that, I don't want to get into all that, but even here in the US, in their election. But Russia, Putin is clearly emboldened by the rhetoric, that Trump projects, while ironically, again, just like in the case of China, while actually taking steps that are tougher on Russia in the place that it cares about most, which is Ukraine. So it was Trump, again, who sent this is all, this is a big part of the whole impeachment inquiry came up, about these Javelin missiles. The Javelin missiles, the anti-tank missiles. The previous administration would not send them, would not send those to Ukraine. It was seen as too provocative. It was too antagonistic to Russia. It was seen as creating what would be a proxy war. And we see that Donald Trump did that, but at the same time undermines that with a rhetoric that's very supportive of Vladimir Putin in a lot of areas. So again, a confusion that has imposed a cost. And then what I would say is, and here's where it gets really, I think, interesting. What has been the actual net the impact of this? What have we learned? In my view, it's relatively optimistic. We've learned that despite all of this confusion, the international system is actually, in my view, a lot of people disagree. You would find maybe even most people would disagree with me on this, but I think it's actually been more resilient, that we haven't had this calamities. Again, it can still be tested, so watch out. But we have NATO in many respects, despite all of these attacks, despite the comments of the French president recently who said it was brain dead, is actually operationally stronger. Stronger even in areas that are very important, including in cyber defense, which is very important against, in the fight against Russia, the defense against Russia. We've also seen, this is something a lot of people don't realize, despite the blow to our image, which has been noticed in polls, so you can't really, again, it's not really debatable. The U.S. is widely seen, according to Pew Research around the world, as more of a threat, really, even than China and Russia. So it's really, our image really has taken a blow. But at the same time, I will tell you, people still clamor for U.S. intervention. An issue that I work on is Libya. And you would think, and you know that's one of the countries that's on the visa ban that Trump did. Remember, Rudy Giuliani said publicly it's a Muslim ban. So Libya is one of those countries. You would think the last country they would want involved in their internal affairs is the United States. It's the opposite. They don't trust the Europeans. They know the Russians have an agenda. They're not really interested in it. They know that the country they want to get involved to help bring peace there is the United States. It's the United States. Look at some other areas. Look at the sanctions that have been put on Iran. We've done that unilaterally. We walked away from the agreement, which was a multilateral agreement done with our key European allies, the P5+1, which include Germany and China and Russia. Think about that. And the Europeans were furious with us for doing this. Trump, what are you doing? We believe in that agreement with Iran. We want that agreement. And you know what? To this day, the Europeans have not been able to figure out a way to get around the sanctions so that European companies will trade with Iran the way they want to do. Why? Because what we've learned is it's still the access to the U.S. market, which they have not been able to come up with a device that would keep them from running afoul of our sanctions, is too valuable to them. So they still, despite every effort, same with China, despite efforts at alternative currency trading, have not been able to come up with that. This is significant for American power. Now, how long will that last? How long will that last? If we have a recession, if they come up with more sophisticated ways, if they come up with alternative currencies, other ways, cryptocurrency methods, maybe that could change, but for the moment, that has not. What else we learned? We learned that we're able to, for example, use force. In Syria, we used force twice. It didn't get us on any slippery slope. We didn't get on any slippery slope, and it did. At least the second time, it seems to have had a significant deterrent effect on Bashar Assad on the use of chemical weapons. Not a guarantee, but it seems to have had an effect, and it has not, we haven't had any significant blowback from that use of force. So that's again, pulling out of the Iran deal. That's still not over. It's still quite tenuous. We don't really know what the Iranians have done or are going to do. But for the moment, it seems as if we have turned the tables, and by walking out of this agreement, an agreement that we signed up to, of course, the Iranians have no trust in us, and it would be extraordinarily difficult to have another agreement with them. But for the moment, they're the ones who are under severe pressure. And I would point out, ironically again, in the Middle East, it's the Iranians who are under severe pressure. You may not know this. There have been significant demonstrations against the Iranians in Iraq and in Lebanon. In Iraq, they even burned the Iranian consulate in the town of Karmel. So, for the moment, again, it's too soon, but in reality, that's what we might point out. China, we've clearly been able to, in some way, confront China about its activities without it immediately producing some kind of conflagration. Now, again, it's tenuous and it's dangerous because both Trump and Xi, the leader in China, both nationalists, and so that's a very dangerous thing because then they have to feel immediately the pressure to look strong in front of their people. And that's when, in miscalculation, things can go quickly off the right. So it's tenuous there. So in sum, let me close and just say that if I were telling the next president, briefing him about this and what to do, I would say, learn from the exploitation of American power that Donald Trump has used, and learn from his mistakes. Use the power that we clearly have, use it judiciously, and don't make gratuitous offenses to our allies that weaken our power. And I think that that ultimately would be the kind of message that a president, a future president might digest. But I want to hear what you all have to say. Thank you very much.
Just a few quick points before I turn it back over for the Q&A and dialogue. I hope you know what you're asking for. As we started last time, and I'd like to try to make this traditional, I'd like to slot in a few students to start us off. So a couple of the students that have questions or comments could line up. All questions and comments line up behind. And although our speaker is interested in comments as well as questions, one thing I would ask is that once we get going, I think you'll find there'll be a line back there. So please be considerate about how much microphone time you take so that everybody gets a chance. And then lastly, I have one other issue. Is there a Joan S. Richards in the room? See me after the meeting, it's all good. Thank you.
Hi. What do you think Trump's main error is in his foreign policy?
That's a great question. Yes, the question was, what do I think is Trump's main error in his foreign policy? And the way I would approach this, again, I'm going to use my model. So I'm going to take away the substantive areas there, climate change, migration, just because it's just not going to be productive. It's obvious if you're concerned about climate change, then, and the danger and threat that poses to the globe, then obviously that's the obvious answer. But I think the main error, if you look at the sort of other issues, is I'm going to move away from specifics and not, alliances and the attack on the liberal order, all of that. But I would, to say something new, I think his main error is that he simply refuses to think analytically about what he's trying to achieve. That is really his main error. And that takes him into areas at times where his instincts are correct. Saying that, I put out here, Henry Kissinger, when they asked him about Trump, he said, listen, the most important thing about a president are his instincts. And so his instincts in some areas have been correct, like China, but his refusal to, just the utter lack of discipline, the utter inability to think of, these are my objectives, how am I going to achieve them? Just like we all do in our lives. What you got to do is a normal way of life. That is his main error. Next question.
Yes, sir. I've always thought that in foreign policy, the most interesting element is continuity between seemingly opposite administrations. The multi-year engagement with China, Carter and Reagan at the end of Daytona. And so, what can we learn from the continuity between Obama and Trump as it relates to long-term prospects between the U.S. and the Europeans that President Macron talked about? The Europeans were irritated when President Obama had the so-called pivot to China. Yes. And there's been a lot of disdain over Trump's, seemingly contempt for NATO. When you look at the Obama and Trump administrations combined, what does that say about long-term prospects for U.S.-European relations?
Thank you. Excellent question. And you're absolutely right that the norm is, despite in politics and the change in party of one president to the other, it's not in all issues, but in most issues there is a general continuity. And we see Trump has blown that up in a lot of respects. Blew that up on the Iranian, blew that up in China, blew it up in North Korea. Where I'll say this, where he and Obama have a continuity is on their attitude towards foreign interventions and deployment of troops overseas. And that is very much continuity. Obama, pulled all the troops out of Iraq in 2011. That was, there's a debate then about whether then that led to ISIS and so on, and was headed towards pulling the troops out of Afghanistan. And very similar to Trump, believed that he was elected for that purpose. That's what Barack Obama believed. He believed he was elected. That that was, and it's true. One reason he got the nomination over Hillary was he had opposed the Iraq War. And so he really wanted to be, Barack Obama wanted to be the president who pulled our troops out of both Iraq and Afghanistan. But he realized once the ISIS mess opened up in Iraq and the Taliban resurgency in Afghanistan, he realized that wasn't possible anymore. So Trump shares that, and but he's, again, inconsistent and willing to do things regardless of what advisors tell him and regardless of even modest costs.
Hello, I'm a Syrian citizen, so I would like to have your perspective regarding some local issues that were happening in Syria from the perspective of foreign policy approaches by Trump. Do you think that the American attacks, lies that happened last year, were enough and sufficient to refrain the Assad regime from committing human rights violations? And I have a second part of my question, if you don't mind. Don't you think that if Clinton was the president today, that as Syrian people we would have witnessed less bloodshed when it comes to advocating for no-fly zones, as this was part of Clinton's agenda towards Syria and towards Syria.
Thank you for those questions, and of course we all here feel for you and your citizens there in Syria who have suffered just an incredible disaster, tragedy in your country. About half the population of Syria is displaced, either in the country or outside as refugees. Almost half of about 24 million person country, maybe not quite half, but approaching it. And so the first question was about Trump's strikes and whether it will deter Assad from using chemical weapons. And the second question was if Hillary had been elected, would there be less bloodshed because she would have been more inclined to put up a no-fly zone. First question, I think, and many people would disagree with this. Many people would disagree with me. But I believe the two strikes did have a deterrent effect, particularly the second strike. Both were in April, successive years. I think particularly the second strike did have a deterrent effect on Assad, but it's not an absolute. It's not an absolute, and a lot of it depends on the situation on the ground, and he uses those chemical weapons, those horrific weapons, for military purposes, to carry out a military political purpose. Also, though, the fact that we are pulling out the troops from Syria goes two ways. You could say, on the one hand, it shows less of an interest of Trump in Syria. On the other hand, if our troops are out, then there's less exposure. We have less military, we're less vulnerable. So I think what it's done, and really, it's what you want in this kind of situation, I think it's created uncertainty for Assad, the Iranians, and the Russians. It's an additional complexity. What are the Americans going to do? What are the Americans? So that raises the cost of using the chemical weapons. For Hillary, it's a very good question. The thrust of it, what you say, may be right. You may well be right, but of course it's impossible to know. It's just impossible to know, but it's possible that she might have been more inclined than either Obama or Trump to use some force. And I would just quickly add this, that for people who say, you see those signs sometimes, they say war is not the answer. Of course, nobody wants war. I mean, really, the last of the military war. But, sometimes force, and sometimes you have to do that. So, in your case, Syria has been such a regional and international disaster that when you think about what we could have done, it's always easy to say we shouldn't get involved, but that's a clear example of, gee, there were costs. Please.
Thank you so much for your insight and analysis. My question is, with our rather hasty retreat from Syria, do you anticipate that we will also, more sooner rather than later, do so in Afghanistan?
I thank you for your comment, and yeah, I think, and I'd be interested in what Dr. Smallwood has to say about this, having himself been out there for a longer period than I was. I think we are headed out of Afghanistan. I think I think there's pretty much a consensus. This isn't just Trump, and it's not just Obama. I think that there's pretty much a consensus that you just can't make this place much better. It's a terrible tragedy, it's a terrible thing to say, and no one should celebrate that. No one should say, yay, we're out of Afghanistan, because it's going to be a terribly dangerous place. It's going to be terribly dangerous. And just remember, you know, they'll say, yay, yay, we got out. And of course, we want to, you know, we don't want our troops unnecessarily exposed to risk, but well, let's look at the level of casualties are very, very low. But we should remember what happened in the past when the Russians pulled out, and they had a sort of a caretaker regime that collapsed in the early 90s. Taliban came in, invited Al-Qaeda in, and we got 9/11. So hopefully we're smarter than that, and there's assets and things that we can do, but it's still very complicated. Pakistan complicates it. Pakistan makes it almost impossible for us to succeed there. They use the Taliban as force projection in their obsession with India. And the Afghans themselves, it's just such a difficult country. I was there, I was just so thunderstruck by the level of illiteracy in the country. It's very, very difficult, and yes, I think we're on our way.
Thank you very much for being here. In full disclosure, I work very closely with the UN. My question is about the UN, and I worked with UNSMIL and a number of humanitarian agencies in Syria. Our positioning around, and the President's positioning around the UN wasn't just Nikki Haley. It wasn't just a number of other very high-profile issues, but it has to do with reform within the system and otherwise. The UN is still going to be here in 2020. What can we effectively expect to do to help the UN progress in the short run? There's all these other issues, but they do have an influence on them.
Very important point. You know, I was just reading today, there was one of these articles, this is in Time magazine, and this is right on point. It was one of these real doom and gloom, which again I think is most people that, you know, the end of the American-led order, the end of the liberal order, the end of that, and constantly repeating that. And it's so critical. Again, I'm in the camp that says it's not all over the liberal international order, and all that these institutions. The United Nations was a product of this post-World War II American-led order set up. And it is very important for us to maintain these international organizations, and more important now, as this country's fracture, as this nationalism grows, as the use of social media, the use of the Russian exploits to sow confusion in democracies, it's very important to have international organizations that can set rules of conduct. People say, oh, nobody has to listen to this. It still has an effect, and it still has quite an important role to have internationally agreed standards of behavior. They are still modified on the behavior of states and behavior of a lot of the line actors. So we need, whatever administration is in place, we need very much to improve and support international organizations.
Mr. Joseph, the abrupt secession of troops from Syria is viewed by many, as you said, as a timid move by Trump. What would have been a better alternative for such an impulsive decision, and how would it affect the image of the United States?
Thank you for that. And I have an answer for that. A lot of people will say, well, oh, the Kurds. I read this recently. Someone was, I know who was a very smart person who, in an article otherwise, who said, oh, the Kurds were always going to have to cut the best deal they could with Turkey. And so on. I don't agree with that at all. If Turkey, once the ISIS threat, the immediate ISIS threat was eliminated, of course, then we kept Turkey at bay because we needed the Kurds to do the fighting, so that our guys didn't have to do the fighting. And fighting that you cannot just do from the air. You really can't. A lot of the fighting against a ruthless organization like ISIS, which incredibly dangerous, more dangerous than Al-Qaeda because even greater global inspiration to do these horrific acts. And so we really needed the Kurds there, and we kept Turkey at bay. I think we could have continued to negotiate with you. We have a very effective special envoy. His name is James Jeffrey. He used to be the ambassador in Turkey. The Turks know him. The Turks know that we are not just against them and pro-Kurd. We let the Kurds come in, we let the Turks come into a town that was on the border. This was way back about January, February, called Afrin. And we basically told the Kurds, too bad, we're letting the Turks come in. They were kept pressing, they didn't want the Kurds that close in their position on the border, and we let Turkey have it and told the Kurds, too bad. So, come on, we had built up a certain amount of credibility with Turkey and with Erdogan. So it wasn't like they looked at us as this adversary that was just backing one side against them. And we could have continued to negotiate and work and come up with different kinds of accommodations. It wouldn't have been easy. It would not have been easy. There have been occasional skirmishes. But I think if we had stayed involved, and plus it would have kept us involved politically with what the Russians and Iranians were doing, I think that we could have had certainly a better deal than what they got and what they deserved. And which want to come back to hurt us. Please.
There is an article on CNN today about the U.S. economy losing billions of dollars because international students are not enrolled. Do you think Trump foreign policy has a role in this?
Thank you. The article said that what's the impact of the U.S. economy?
The U.S. economy is losing billions of dollars because international students are not enrolling.
Oh, yes.
Please repeat the question.
Let me repeat the question. This gentleman pointed out there's an article in CNN that says apparently the U.S. economy is hurting, suffering in the tune of billions of dollars because we don't have international students. And what I presume that's about is because of the Trump immigration policies and making it more difficult, I presume. And I have no reason to believe that that's not true. I have no reason to believe that that's not true. And again, this is why I kept migration out, because it's immediately, you're immediately on one side, and I think he's completely wrong on migration, and our unemployment rates and things are so low that these are assets to us. And so, anyway, but I thank you for pointing that out.